One of the defining rivalries of the Berserk franchise is the one shared by Guts and the immortal god of the battlefield, Nosferatu Zodd. Zodd is the first apostle that Guts faces off against from a canonical perspective, and theirs is a rivalry that has become as important to the series as any other major dynamic from Berserk. The Beast Swordsman and the Black Swordsman have fought each other on at least 3 separate occasions, and rather unexpectedly, have even worked together once. But each time their fights have been cut short by causality's grand game, or Griffith, or sometimes both. So we're here to put the discussion to bed. How will Guts and Zodd's rivalry reach its conclusion? And who will win in the end? Let's find out. 2 warriors with the same goal who took different paths in life. The basis for Guts and Zodd's rivalry. The rivalry between Guts and Zodd is, in many ways, a rivalry of differing perspectives on the same subject, which is becoming the absolute strongest. For a long time, Guts had no purpose in his life beyond surviving until the next day. He would stake his life upon battles that any sane man would avoid as a means of verifying his own existence, and he sharpened his battle instincts, not to prove his own valor, but to improve his skill. Guts has always been an exceptional fighter, even from a young age. His takedown of Bezuso is proof enough of that, though he did admittedly get lucky during that fight. The years that he spends as a part of the Band of the Falcon hones his already sharp instincts to a razor-fine edge, to the point he can jump into approaching cavalry alone and cause enough ruckus to give his comrades a winning opening. He goes on to defeat the esteemed Tudor war general Boscoin in a one-on-one fight, and he even takes down 100 elite Tudor knights in a single night all by himself, while being injured on top of it. Those events don't happen in the order we've listed them here, but they display Guts' unspoken inner motivation to be the best swordsman on Earth. He realizes this is his dream when he spends a year away from the Falcons, training in the mountains with the help of Godot and his daughter Erica. Initially, Guts left Griffith's service to find his own path in a way that would make him his equal. Being Griffith's equal meant Guts had to find a dream of his own, and that was his intention from the beginning, to find a new goal in life. He ended up acquiring a new perspective instead, which was maybe what he needed all along. As Guts spent his days trying to cut down logs falling from a waterfall with nothing but his sword, he came to understand that his sword itself was what gave him purpose. Guts once asked Godot why he was a blacksmith, and Godot told him it was because of the sparks that were birthed whenever he struck steel with his hammer. Godot saw life in that fleeting reaction, and Guts understands that so does he. Only his sparks come from the clashing of swords on the battlefield. During his year-long journey of introspection, Guts realizes that his purpose has always been to fight, but he will no longer fight to survive. He'll fight to test himself against the greatest, most skilled fighters in the world, and prove his blade's worth with his victories. He didn't say it out loud, but Guts set his sights upon the title of the strongest swordsman in the world, and a big influence on his reasoning was the immortal one. It was through fighting Zodd that Guts discovered a whole other life form to battle, with a power level that he could only have dreamt about before. Now, he wants to take a step towards his own dream of finding his own spark in life by fighting battles on his own terms. He doesn't want to cling to another man's dream. His dream is to become a better fighter for his own sake. To that end, he embarrasses Salat in their first and second meeting, despite never having seen the guy's exotic Bakiraka fighting style. Guts aims to become the strongest by testing himself against the strongest, which is poetic irony because so does Nosferatu Zodd. If you were to ask Zodd what his purpose in life was, he would say it's to fight the absolute strongest opponents he can. It's likely that that's part of the reason why he became an apostle in the first place. We know the God Hand likes to hand out deals that exploit a person's innermost desires, and judging by the Immortal One's mastery over all kinds of weapons, it's not a stretch to assume that Zodd was a warrior even in his human life. As an apostle, he's walked this earth for 300 years, showing up in random battlefields and slaughtering everyone in sight before disappearing for a few years only to do it all over again. Because he's likely witnessed 2 eclipse cycles, Zodd has fought countless human beings and apostles in his search for the strongest, and the closest he's come to achieving his goal is fighting Skull Knight. Well, sort of, but we'll get to that later. If you've seen any of our videos on the guy, and you really should if you haven't already, Skull Knight is one of the strongest characters in all of Berserk. He doesn't show up frequently, but when he does, he shreds apostles like he just put them in a blender on high speed. In fact, the only apostle that has withstood his moves in his entire existence is Zodd, so that should give you an idea as to just how powerful the Immortal One really is. But this is the basis of the rivalry between Guts and Nosferatu Zodd, 2 warriors aiming to become the strongest, though for entirely different reasons, which end up evolving over time. Now that you understand why these guys would be best friends if they weren't diametrically opposed to each other, let's get into the meat of their rivalry. Guts vs. Zodd, Round 1. The immortal beast of the battlefield meets the unstoppable beast of the Falcon. Guts and Zodd come face to face for the first time in this second chapter of Berserk. Griffith's band of the Falcon is tasked with assaulting a two-door occupied fortress, and usually, his raider unit was enough to get the job done. But this time, Guts had not sent word back to Griffith of the fortress's capture, as the Falcon had come to expect, which prompted Judo to recall a rumor. He relayed to the Falcons that Nosferatu Zodd had joined the 100 Years' War on Tudor's side, which drew a mixed reaction from those gathered. The ones who didn't know about him were surprised to learn that there was a man strong enough to hold off Guts, and the ones who did know him became terrified for the raider captain's life. Zodd was known by mercenaries as the battlefield god for reasons we mentioned in the last section. He was a total enigma besides that, which is what made him so terrifying. It turns out that the reason Guts hasn't reported back to Griffith with a status update is because he's sent 50 men into the fortress and none have returned alive. One guy almost did, but he died warning the others of Zodd's presence before succumbing to his wounds. This enraged Guts enough for him to take matters into his own hands, and so he headed inside alone, with the full intent of breaking the person responsible for hurting his comrades. Instead, he found himself being gripped by the yoke of fear as he saw his fallen men cleaved and torn in half as though a monster had run them through. He found two of his men's feet dangling in midair from something noose-like as he was searching for his mark within the fortress, but he soon realized that that something was the Immortal One's sword. Guts charged headfirst into the situation after witnessing the literal mound of his comrades' corpses behind his enemy. But when Zodd countered his approach by flinging the corpses dangling off his sword into Guts like lifeless ragdolls, the swordsman realized what he had truly gotten himself into. Guts managed to get his blade up quick enough to deflect the bodies off of himself, but the blow from Zodd was so powerful, he crashed into a pillar several meters away. Seeing this massive naked man holding a curved sword in his right arm and the mangled skull and helmet of one of his raiders in the other, made Guts question just what Zodd was. Guts is by far one of the biggest characters in the series, well over 6 feet in height, but Zodd towers over him as though Guts were a child. He's somehow more built than Guts, and one swipe from his sword can break through concrete. Don't believe us? Just ask Guts, because after complimenting him on parrying that first hit, Zodd breaks the pillar Guts had his back against with a horizontal slash that wouldn't even have put a dent in it if it were done by a regular person. The Immortal One's inhuman presence and sheer bloodlust were strong enough to stun Guts into a strictly defensive game, and this is when their first fight with each other really takes off. After using the flat of his blade to block about a half dozen blows from Zodd, Guts realizes he can't play defense forever. He's outmatched in every physical aspect in front of Zodd, and he outright admits the Immortal One is the strongest opponent he's ever faced. The brief smile that crosses his face shows you that even before he knew his goal was to become the strongest swordsman, Guts enjoyed a challenging fight. And the only way he saw himself getting out of this one was to bet it all on one decisive strike. He had realized that only their swords were evenly matched in the contest, so he bet it all on a move, a decision Zodd instantly understood from Guts' stance and decided to play into. When Guts survives his initial barrage, Zodd tells the kid that no one in the last 50 years has put up a fight like that against him. He sees Guts prepare for a do-or-die death strike, and he instantly knows what's coming next and accepts the wager just to see what happens. Zodd knows Guts means to leverage blade length for a decisive blow, only he miscalculates where the blow would land. He thinks, like every fighter would, that Guts is going to go for his body. Instead, Guts breaks Zodd's sword with his do-or-die strike and uses the momentary hesitation of the Immortal One to strike down with all his might. His second strike eats through Zodd's left shoulder and nearly takes off his arm as well, which he raised to protect himself, but just a bit too late. Normally, such an attack would mean instant death for a person. Guts actually breathes a sigh of relief when he plunges his sword through Zodd because he thinks he's won. He doesn't know a single thing about God hands and apostles just yet, so the fear on his face is both palpable and real when he feels his sword being yanked out of place by a man who should have been dead by his estimation. Zodd proclaims his surprise at Guts' gamble, but then praises him for being the first human to push him this far in a fight for nearly 3 centuries. As a reward, he decides to transform into his released state as an apostle, to honor his opponent and fully savor this battle of a lifetime. If Zodd was intimidating before, he looked downright terrifying now. He transforms into a chimera-like beast with the head and paws of a lion, the tail of a giant lizard, the hindquarters of a horse, and the horns of some kind of devil, we're guessing. Guts is completely rattled by Zodd's true appearance. He starts sweating bullets and questioning how monsters like him can even exist in the first place. Zodd pounces on him with his massive paws, and it takes all of Guts' might to dodge them. He finds one opening in amidst all of his Hail Mary dodging and uses it to try and take off Zodd's left horn, but to his dismay, it was to no avail. Guts' sword barely dents Zodd's horn, and the Immortal One smacks him into a pillar head first, nearly knocking him out. He approaches the swordsman, lamenting the fact that his best fight in the last 300 years had to end this quickly, but decides that if Guts won't fight, he'll tear him apart. Just as the Immortal One's claws bite into Guts' flesh, he's attacked by the Band of the Falcon, who have arrived under Griffith's command to save their raider captain. If Griffith hadn't made the executive decision to move in and save Guts when he didn't come out of the fortress, Berserk would have ended right then and there. Zodd had Guts beat, but 2 consecutive volleys, or at least a couple scores worth of arrows, drew his attention away from his target. The Immortal One started rampaging and killed half a dozen falcons in quick succession. He was pissed that these puny weaklings were trying to interrupt his fight, and his agitation only increased when Griffith tried to escape with Guts. He entreated the swordsman to fight as long as he had a beating heart, but the duo executed a pincer move on him and evaded his advance. Griffith actually sliced Zodd's left arm completely off his body, but was then knocked out by the Immortal One's tail in a blinding fast retaliation. Guts tried to make a brave final stand, but got brushed aside by Zodd wielding his cut-off arm. The Immortal One effortlessly fuses his severed limb back to its stump and proceeds to finish the fight, so to speak. And this is where things take a turn. Instead of killing Guts and Griffith, Zodd decides to spare them. Heck, he even gives Guts a prophecy before sprouting wings and flying off into the night sky. The reason for this is his realization that Griffith, as the bearer of the Crimson Behelit, is destined to join the God Hand. So he decides to put his fight with Guts on hold until they meet again, at the same time wondering if they ever will. The prophecy he gives Guts is one of eternal death, as Zodd basically warns Guts about the eclipse years before it actually happens. But if we had to look at this encounter from a pure battle perspective, it was an overwhelming victory for Zodd. In fact, after this fight, Guts realized that he will have to be prepared to defend against inhuman monsters like Zodd, which is what caused him to go off on that training arc we mentioned earlier. His net defeat to Zodd is a crucial turning point in Guts' life, as it becomes one of his primary motivators to become stronger than he was. And this pays off dividends in their second fight, although the price Guts pays to get to that point far outweighs any sort of profits you can imagine coming out of such a rivalry. Guts vs. Zodd, Round 2. A match forged in deadly combat between 2 beastly swordsmen. The second time Guts and Zodd fight, they are much more evenly matched, but the circumstances surrounding their rivalry have changed entirely. In their first fight, Zodd was still looking for a challenge that satisfied his deepest desire. He admitted that Griffith, and Guts especially, came pretty close to his definition of that from a human perspective, but his search remained incomplete. He curses the fact that only a wretch like Skull Knight can give him his heart's desire. The second time they fight, Zodd has not only met the strongest, but he's also suffered a defeat to it, that person being none other than Griffith. See, when Zodd realized Griffith was destined to become a God Hand, he didn't just spare his life, he actively helped Griffith ascend. During the Battle of Doldrey, there was a point where it looked like Guts might lose his fight with Boscoin. The Tudor general was an ox of a man, and he actually managed to break Guts' sword in their deadly dance. Out of nowhere, Zodd appeared on the battlefield's horizon and tossed Guts' sword that helped him kill Boscoin and secure a key victory for Griffith. Zodd helped Griffith survive an attack by the rogue apostle Wild, and even killed the guy when he threatened to betray the will of causality. Guts had managed to beat Wild into a near-death state, and he actually becomes the first apostle to become a Black Swordsman casualty, but it's Zodd who finishes the job. Wild plays possum after Guts leaves him mortally wounded, and kidnaps Griffith in hopes of using his Crimson Behelit to save himself. Zodd skewers Wild with his horns for that, and tells Griffith not to worry about his Behelit being lost to him, because when he needed it most, it would return to him. Zodd becomes the gatekeeper of Griffith's eclipse, and is the first apostle contacted by the new God Hand in preparation for the coming of the New World. Following Griffith's rebirth into Femto, he visits Zodd on an ethereal plane that melds the conscious and unconscious in the form of a bright white falcon. When the Immortal One asks him why he's come, Femto simply replies he was there to give him his heart's desire, and Zodd understands a challenge when he hears one. He transforms into his released state immediately, intending to fight the very being that was his natural master. But just when he thinks he can play ball with a God Hand, he's brought to his senses. Femto slices off Zodd's left horn, the same horn Guts had targeted in their first fight, and when Zodd feels the wound manifest in the physical world as well, he realizes his wish had finally been fulfilled. Griffith gave him a wound that went beyond the confines of what he could fix. Zodd never regrew the horn he lost to the White Falcon that day. His other horn seems to be compensating for it by increasing in size. But the point is this: from that day onward, Zodd became Griffith's right-hand man. When he manifested into the physical world thanks to the incarnation ceremony, Zodd was the first apostle to show up and pledge himself to Griffith's service. Now, granted, he was told to do this by Griffith himself, but Zodd would never agree to such a request unless he thought Griffith truly fit his definition of the strongest being possible. He now serves as the Falcon of Light's primary mode of transportation and foremost apostle lieutenant. His purpose has changed from seeking the strongest to serving the strongest. And it is within this context that he meets Guts as a challenger the second time. Zodd's loyalty to Griffith is such that he will kill even apostles that threaten to disrupt the order Griffith has established, so naturally you can imagine his feelings towards Guts. When Zodd saw Guts survive the madness of the eclipse, he was baffled because, number one, that doesn't happen, and number two, Guts' life might have been better off forfeit. As a bearer of the brand of sacrifice, he would now be plagued by evil astral creatures every night for the rest of his life, right up until the moment of his death. Zodd wanted to see how Guts would survive such an inhuman fate, and to his delight, Guts does so marvelously. Unfortunately for Guts, he does so at the cost of his own sanity, which slips further into the metaphorical abyss each time he comes within the proximity of an apostle. The eclipse fundamentally changes Guts and his outlook on life. In some ways, he regresses to the distrustful persona of his youth, lashing out at the people that tried to touch him, and just generally being the biggest cynic in the room. But because the eclipse was like 1,000 times worse for him mentally than even Donovan, it turns him into a rage-filled beast of a man, whose only guiding light is the red ray of revenge. Before the eclipse, Guts had fought a total of 2 apostles, and defeated only one of them, that too with the other's assistance. During the eclipse, he killed dozens upon dozens of apostles trying to keep himself and Casca alive. Over the course of the 2 years he spent as the infamous Black Swordsman following the eclipse, Guts managed to amass an apostle kill count that puts entire armies to shame. He put every part of his body on the line to make Griffith and the rest of the God Hand pay for what they did to his friends, and the love of his life. By the time Zodd and Guts reunited as enemies upon the Hill of Swords, Guts had survived the incarnation ceremony's blood flow of the dead, which decimated the entire population of a bustling town. His primary motivation was no longer to become the strongest. Guts was fighting solely so he could one day decapitate Griffith himself. But in his pursuit of this newfound goal, he unintentionally fulfills his original aim to test himself by continuously fighting stronger opponents, which is basically what his life becomes after the eclipse. Apostles are some of the strongest creatures in the Berserkverse. Even the weakest apostle is stronger than the worst kaiju any of its regular citizenry can imagine. Guts made hunting them down his life's mission, and in return, he now possesses the only body and mind in the world truly capable of dealing with those demonic monstrosities. Sure, he refocuses his primary motivation towards protecting Casca during and following the conviction arc, but Guts himself admits that beyond that one anchoring goal, all he thinks about is getting his revenge. And to achieve that, he has acquired every tool that can help him make that possible. Guts gets a massive upgrade to his arsenal of weapons before round 2 with Zodd. He has a mechanical arm with a secret cannon and rapid-fire crossbow in it. He has expanded his attack game to include throwing knives, a tribute to his fallen comrade Judo. He has Puck as his constant eyes and ears in a battle, who can also help Guts create quick distractions with his Puck Spark ability. Rickert gives him tiny explosives that work just as well as grenades. And, most of all, he has his trusty Dragon Slayer, a hulking behemoth of a broadsword that can cleave half a dozen grown men in full-plate armor clean in two. While Guts was a nightmarish opponent to deal with before the eclipse, he was a nightmare personified now, and fighting Zodd was more in his wheelhouse than ever before. Their second battle begins when Guts rushes towards Griffith, who had shown up at the Hill of Swords to test his own emotions, knowing full well what would happen. The reborn Falcon has the gall to say he didn't feel a drop of emotion at the thought of having betrayed his former comrades, which obviously makes Guts charge at him, Dragon Slayer first. He hurls his burly sword in the direction of his former leader when it's intercepted by an equally massive Kushan Ramdao. Nosferatu Zodd intercepts a lethal strike intended to harm his god, and at least this time he's got some clothes on. The Immortal One expresses his delight at Guts' survival despite his prediction for him to his face, and pushes him off their sword clash with a gnarly swing that breaks many of Rickert's tribute swords buried in the snow, completely snapped in half. The exchange that follows is blindingly fast, but we'll try to sum it up. Zodd follows Guts after knocking him back, but Guts gymnastics himself into a standing position, which is countered by a punch from Zodd to the left side of Guts' head that he blocks with his mechanical arm. Then Zodd uses his sword arm to sneak in a fatal stab, but Guts deflects it with his sword. And if this is getting confusing for you guys, we empathize. The point is, where he was playing strictly defense in their first fight, Guts was now actively counterattacking Zodd's every move with lightning-quick instincts and precision. He was so in the zone that he only registered Zodd retreating to a safer range mid-death strike. The Immortal One is a schoolboy at a candy shop at this point. This is exactly what he had hoped would happen to Guts following his survival at the eclipse. He was shocked to see such discipline in a mere human, and it's doubly impressive stuff considering this is pre-Berserker armored Guts. The Black Swordsman is confused to see Zodd with Griffith, but he knows he'll only get his answers by forcing his way past the Immortal One. They re-engage in their deadly dance, and it's such a flurry of fury that one tiny misstep and either beast could have lost its head. At one point, Guts actually manages to crack Zodd's sword once again, but this time it doesn't fully break. The Immortal One draws on his centuries worth of battle experience to quickly pick up one of the swords buried in the hill and switch to a two-handed fighting style. But Guts is just as wily, and he kicks a sword into Zodd's guts to force a stalemate, pun very much intended. It's not that the impact of Zodd's blows has softened over the years. Guts claims he can feel his bones ringing with each strike he parries. But it's his wrath, his malice, his rage that fuels his body to push beyond its previous physical limitations. With Griffith so close to him, all Guts can think about Zodd is that furry giant was in his way, and he was determined to make that not the case. That kind of adrenaline can make you ignore dislocated limbs and literal holes in your body. Just ask any late 90s hardcore pro wrestler. Zodd is beyond thrilled by his growth as a swordsman, and even gives Guts' late friend Godot a veiled compliment by calling his Demon Slayer's sword splendid. But he knows his own weapon is pretty much done for, and his lust for the battle hasn't been fully sated yet. Zodd transforms into his release state while breaking his sword in half, and Guts now prepares for the real fight. The Black Swordsman had improved immeasurably as a fighter since his first encounter with Zodd. The fact that he got knocked back and didn't fold the first time Zodd laid hands on him was evidence enough, but it's his handling of Zodd's released form that truly shows you just how dangerous Guts himself has become. Though the terrain is far less enclosed than that Tudor fortress, it affords mobility to both fighters, and quite frankly, at this point in the story, a close setting would favor no one more than Guts. The Black Swordsman is able to effectively parry and dodge the Immortal One's pounces, whilst landing a couple of lethal slashes through his abdomen. Hell, Guts gets flung into the air by Zodd with his one horn, and he tanks it like it's a little piece of bamboo on his pinky toe. Their fight ended up putting Casca in danger, as Zodd crashed through Godot's mine and sent multiple boulders flying in her direction. It's at this point that this fight effectively stopped being a fight. Guts would have gone berserk on Zodd's ass had anything happened to Casca, but he was stunned in place because Griffith ended up saving her. He then retreated with Zodd, leaving Guts with a "I'ma go chase my dream dog" and all of us in confusion. We learn in chapter 181 that this weird turn of events took place because of the feelings of the demon child that had fused into Griffith's incarnation vessel. But had that not been the case, we would have still called round 2 a time limit draw. Both Zodd and Guts are now equally matched in terms of strength and technique in their base forms. Zodd overpowers Guts in his release state, but the Black Swordsman is wily enough to work around it. This is what makes their third encounter kind of frustrating, but not in the way you might expect. Guts vs. Zodd, round 3, a battle of priorities. Before fighting each other for a third time, Guts and Zodd have two significant non-combative encounters. The first is at Flora's Spirit Tree mansion. When Guts and co return from their mission to Clipoff, they realize their base was being attacked by apostles, and Guts immediately jumps into the fray. He's mostly focused on fighting the Flame Dragon Apostle Grunbelt, who proves to be as imposing an enemy as Zodd. The Immortal One, in the meantime, is focused on fighting his eternal enemy. He is so hot at the prospect of fighting Skull Knight again that he kills an apostle that was technically trying to help him out. The pair put a pause on their familiar routine when Guts emerges as the Berserker to bear witness to his newfound powers. Zodd comments on the nostalgia this must invoke within Skull Knight, which tells us that while he might not have fought Berserker Skull Knight, Zodd was at the very least aware of his full past. The next time he sees Guts is in Vritannis, and this is where an interesting development takes place in their dynamic. Before the battle at Vritannis Harbor, Zodd was told by the reborn Band of the Falcon seer that he would soon face a crucial choice: to continue fighting the sword that once cut his flesh, or to turn it into his own weapon. In Vritannis, both Guts and Zodd's apostles are fighting against a common enemy, the Kushan Emperor Ganishka. Both the Beast Swordsman and the Black Swordsman were unsuccessful in their individual attempts to defeat the mighty Thundercloud Apostle. But when Zodd realized Guts knew how to damage Ganishka and just needed a ride to do it, he decided to turn Dragon Slayer into his own weapon. Zodd allowed Guts to ride on his back, as he allows Griffith to ride on his back. When Guts threatens him to do as he tells him to, Zodd lets him know that his bloodlust makes the Immortal One immensely happy. The two enemies managed to fly through the brow of the Dread Emperor, which was the spiritual anchor for his released form. They both emerge looking like they'd just been put through the electric chair, and as soon as they're back up, Zodd decides to press Guts on the conditions for their short-lived alliance. Zodd only agreed to work with Guts, granted he got a piece of him afterward, but seeing his enemy answer his call in such a damaged state must have awoken some kind of twisted sympathy within Zodd. He delays their battle for another day, and even stops another apostle from attacking the infamous Black Swordsman. He only threatens to annihilate Guts when Guts threatens to go after Griffith, and when that doesn't happen, Zodd redirects his attention to his own mission. These two instances are important because they show that Zodd has granted Guts the same begrudging respect he holds for Skull Knight. Following the Ganishka incident, Guts and Zodd travel in two different directions as the old world comes to an end. The third time Guts and Zodd fight each other is in the new world, which is brought about by the great roar of the astral world. Zodd is now fully dedicated to being an apostle general in Griffith's reborn Band of the Falcon, and he practically shadows his leader at this point. Zodd is trusted with playing the crucial role of being Griffith's right-hand man in all things. He was there when Griffith visited Guts, he was involved in the rescue of Princess Charlotte, Griffith rode him to the top of Ganishka's head in his Shiva form, the list is exhaustive. Zodd is privy to plans that no one in Griffith's camp is aware of, which is why he shows up at Elfhelm the moment the Moonlight Boy turns back into Griffith. Zodd had already seen Griffith protect Casca despite not consciously wanting to do so. It's very possible that Griffith only included him in his secret plans just to avoid having a loose mouth in the world. But think about Zodd's personality and really ask yourself if that would even be necessary. The trust between the two is proven in concrete terms when Zodd travels to Elfhelm through the world spiral tree and immediately attacks Guts. The Black Swordsman has been doing his best to land a single sword strike on Griffith since his emergence, and failing miserably. When Zodd shows up to protect his master, Guts basically treats him like a distraction. He barely exchanges blows with Zodd, and the moment he gets an opportunity to get away from the fight, he takes it. Guts was focused on trying to protect Casca, mind you, so this makes sense. But he ends up failing to do so anyway, because Griffith takes her in his arms, casually breaks Skellig Island with his spatial powers, and then flies away in Zodd's palm once again. The fact that he couldn't even land a single hit on his mortal enemy sends Guts into a depressive spiral he still hasn't recovered from. For his sake, we hope he does, because he and the Immortal One clearly have some unfinished business. And, as you'll see in the next section, it's all about following the natural progression of this. Guts vs. Zodd, Round 4. Who will win in the end? In many ways, you can think of Zodd as an evil reflection of Guts. Following the incarnation ceremony, he's pretty much played the same role Guts used to play in the old Band of the Falcon. He's there for all of Griffith's major moves, listens in to all his major counsels, and is his foremost partner in crime, be it on the battlefield or otherwise. He's what would happen if Guts forgot his personal morals and values and focused only on the title of the strongest. This isn't to say that Zodd is immoral. In fact, he's one of the very few apostles that doesn't indulge in eating human beings as a pastime and treats worthy opponents with the appropriate respect. But he's like a crystallized version of Guts' dream, if he never built the relationships he had built over the course of his life. The Beast Swordsman and the Black Swordsman really are one and the same in more than just one department, which begs the question, who will win in the end? For starters, let's just say that this question itself is highly suspect, because Zodd's story could easily end fighting Skull Knight instead and it would work just as well. But for the sake of this video, we're going to go with Guts as our primary contender, for all of the reasons we've outlined in this video. The pair are reflections of the same ideals, spoken or unspoken, and have had two decisive face-offs with each other. Round 3 doesn't really count as Round 3 for the reasons we mentioned earlier, so technically, the next fight they have will be the clincher. Zodd has one overwhelming victory over Guts, and the Black Swordsman has a hard-fought tie with the Black Beast at the very best, if you can call it that. What will happen when they fight next? PPV logic would dictate Guts should get the decisive win, and he just might. While Zodd is aware of the Skull Knight's past and has fought him many times over their long association, he's never fought a Berserker SK in his prime. It's very likely that the next time he fights Guts, the latter will be drawing the full powers of the Berserker armor. Just going off of how their first two fights went, it would be logical to assume that Berserker Guts would easily outpace base Zodd. In fact, he would probably dance circles around the guy. The real fight would come down to Berserker Guts versus released Zodd. And this is where things get rather speculative. While we've seen Berserker Guts carve up many an evil astral creature in the story, even a formidable sea god, the only major apostle he's fought is Grunbeld. When Guts fought Grunbeld, he was barely able to put a dent in the guy's skin, and it looked like he aged 10 years fighting the Flame Dragon Knight. Now, granted, Grunbeld's skin is made of corundum, but Guts is still fighting Nosferatu Zodd. Zodd's healing factor has been shown to be near instantaneous. When he sticks a severed limb back to its stump, it starts functioning again immediately, as if it had never been severed. If he gets slashes across his chest, that slash disappears within seconds. Zodd's regeneration could give Wolverine nightmares, and that's not all. Usually, he fights his targets without using his wings, but against a Berserker Guts, Zodd would want every advantage available to him. If he starts flying around the scene at the same speed with which he hunts down his grounded targets, it would make him very difficult to pin down. On the other hand, Guts would become an open target for dive bombs, which, if Zodd uses his horn, could make him look like one of Vlad the Impaler's victims. But this is where Guts' own experience comes in handy as well. Even before he got the Berserker armor, Guts was able to counter a sting attack from the Apostle Rosine. What makes this worth noting is the fact that Rosine's dive bombs broke the sound barrier, producing a rather disorienting sonic boom, and Guts was able to adapt to it after only experiencing it a couple of times. With the Berserker armor's limit-breaking abilities, his reflexes should be enhanced to the point that that kind of feat becomes a normal thing for him. On top of that, if he gets caught by Zodd's cleaver or his paws, Guts doesn't have to worry about his injuries because the armor will just dull its effects for the duration of the fight. He can focus solely on hacking and slashing his way through the Immortal One, and if Guts' treatment of the Pisachagana is any evidence, he'll do so with remorseless glee. If there's any character in the series that could bypass Zodd's healing factor with sheer slashing speed, it's Berserker Guts. And we're going to say that's exactly what will happen should they face each other again. The entire point of having an immortal in your story is to have him be defeated by the most mortal character of that story. And no one feels as mortal as Guts does right now. The way their characters parallel each other, it would be a fitting ending for Zodd's arc to go down fighting Guts instead of Skull Knight. He personifies the pursuit of strength Guts has been on since the beginning of the series, and has been a primary motivator for the same. It's only fitting that the Apostle who effectively created the Black Swordsman be killed by his hand, and from all the data we have on the Berserker armor, that feels like a real possibility. Maybe when Griffith's Eastern expedition takes off, Zodd leads the vanguard as usual and finds Guts opposing him once again. But this time, their fight goes uninterrupted, and it turns out Zodd was the one getting lucky all along. Granted, this can only occur if Guts recovers from his current trance-like condition, and we're not sure how that'll happen in the first place. He's in a condition where he didn't even resist capture and allowed himself to be chained and manhandled. His body is pretty much on the verge of losing all functionality thanks to the way the Berserker armor works. It's becoming clearer by the day that Guts' next big fight will likely be his last ever. We don't think he can survive 5 more uses of the Berserker armor's full power, but if Zodd decides to stand in his way once again as he tries to kill Griffith, then that'll be it. It will bring to an end a rivalry that has become as iconic as any other within Berserk, and our money is on the armored Black Beast, not the furry one. Marvelous verdict! But as for this video, that's all we've got for now. Let us know your thoughts on who wins the rivalry between Zodd and Guts in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.